seated. Song of Solomon chapter 3. Song of Solomon chapter 3 on these Sunday mornings for about 9 to 10 weeks. We are going through the book of Song of Solomon. And if you've missed the first parts of it, I encourage you to go back. I think it's online and listen to it. It'll kind of catch you up to speed. Song of Solomon chapter 3. I've got a lot of verses to cover this morning. I don't want to take 2 weeks in this section. You'll understand that as we get into the verses. I only want to spend 1 week in it. And so I've got to get moving quickly. And if I go a little bit extra time this morning, I'll give myself permission to do that. And if I do, we'll just push everything else. We'll just push choir practice in church and move it right along. But I'll see if I can get through Song of Solomon chapter 3. And we'll cover verse 6 down through chapter 5 and verse 1. All of this is one section here. And we believe that all of the Bible is inspired. You believe that? And I believe it's all profitable. You believe that? And none of it is inappropriate. None of it is wrong. All of it is right. It's infallible, inerrant. And you can open your Bible at any place you want to. Any place. It doesn't matter. And you'll find the words of God and the mind of God on particular subjects. And in Song of Solomon, I believe that primarily you have the mind of God on marriage and intimacy within marriage. There are certainly a lot of types in this book. There's a lot of pictures in this book. You can certainly use this book and deal with relationships as far as Christ and the church is concerned. But I believe that primarily it's about marriage and about marital love and the intimacy within a marriage. It is a great, somebody said this the other day, great book for premarital counseling. And I believe that. One of the earliest heresies to ever be invented in the early centuries of church history was a thing called Gnosticism. Gnosticism. Nobody really knows when it started or who gets the credit for coming up with it. But even in the early church, even in the first centuries, in the apostolic age, Gnosticism had raised its ugly head because in some of the New Testament epistles, some of the apostles strike against Gnosticism. And Gnosticism is more of a philosophy than it is a religion. It comes from a Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. And a Gnostic claims to have special, exclusive knowledge or revelation from God. Among the beliefs that a Gnostic would hold to is that all matter is evil. They would hold to a strict dualism between the physical world and the spiritual world. And since all matter is evil, including the physical body, they would deny that God would ever come down in the flesh and take on a physical body. They believed that Jesus was a pure spirit being, that his flesh was just an illusion. He didn't really have a real physical body because that would have contaminated him with this evil physical world. And since the body is evil, though a necessary evil, they viewed sexual intimacy, even in marriage, as evil. That is where the idea for celibacy as a spiritual thing first found its beginnings. You will find the influence of that thinking in the writings of a lot of early church fathers. Many early church fathers felt that sexual intimacy in marriage was to be discouraged and avoided except in the case of having children for the purpose of procreation. We hardly ever quote early church fathers. One of the reasons why is because they had some really odd ideas. Just to give you an example, Jerome, one of the church fathers, often quoted, here's what he says. He says, "Do you imagine that we approve of any sexual intercourse except for the procreation of children? He who is too ardent a lover of his own wife is an adulterer." You spend too much time with your wife, that's going to qualify as adultery. He's an odd duck. Justin Martyr said, "We Christians marry only to produce children." I say, speak for yourself. Tertullian was a church father, 150 to 230 A.D. And this is think about what he thought about women. He said, Do you not know that you are each an Eve," speaking to women presumably, "the sentence of God on this sex of yours lives in this age. The guilt must of necessity live too. You are the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of the forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You are she." Boy, if ever I've heard inappropriate amens, huh? "You are she who persuaded him whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack. You destroyed so easily God's image, man. And on account of your desert, even the Son of God had to die." How would you like to live to that guy? Augustine, he said, "What is the difference whether it is in a wife or a mother? It is still Eve the temptress that we must beware of in any woman. I fail to see what use woman can be to man if one excludes the function of bearing children." Isn't that amazing? You come all the way to the Reformation time, Martin Luther. He said, "The reproduction of mankind is a great marvel and mystery. Had God consulted me in the matter, I should have advised him to continue the generation of the species by fashioning them out of clay." All I can say is that I'm glad that God is not a Gnostic and that he did not consult Martin Luther on these matters. All the way back to Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, God gave Adam and Eve the command to multiply and to populate and replenish the earth. And the way that they were to accomplish that, chapter 2, is when they two became one flesh. However, sexual pleasure was not just for procreation, it was also for pleasure in marriage. Sex is not evil. It is a beautiful gift that God has given to a man and a woman to be enjoyed only within the bounds of marriage. And nowhere is that described in more vivid detail than in Song of Solomon, and particularly the section that we're looking at this morning, chapter 3, verse 6, all the way down to chapter 5 and verse 1. And I will tell you before we read it that it is a very erotic passage, and it is okay because it is between a man and a woman. These are the verses this morning that would prevent a lot of men from venturing into the Song of Solomon. In fact, a lot of commentators or Bible students have come to this passage and cannot imagine that God would have anything to say about sexual pleasure in marriage, and so they decide to allegorize it into something completely different. The view of the early church fathers, being influenced by the Gnostic teaching, is that the body is evil, and that if you did have intimacy with your wife, then it's only for the purpose of having children. I think it was Augustine, I'm not sure. I think it was Augustine that said that it's not wrong to be intimate with your wife, but if you enjoyed it, then it was a sin. What a strange bird. But in this passage where the marriage is consummated in the bedroom, I want you to notice that there is a striking omission, and it is this: there are no children in the passage. In fact, there's no children in the book. There is no talk of her trying to get pregnant. And the point of it is this, that the intimacy is not for procreation. It was for a man and a wife to enjoy themselves in the most intimate way possible. And what these verses describe is a wedding procession. It would have begun at her house. It ends up in the bridal chamber where they would consummate their marriage. We are literally taken into the bedroom where Solomon and the Shulamite spend their honeymoon together. Solomon describes her beauty. She invites him to come to her. The language is erotic, it is passionate, it is sensual, it is exactly what you would expect it to be in a bedroom on a honeymoon night. However, it is not vulgar. There is no slang, there is no street talk, there is nothing crude, there are no medical terms describing anatomy, there is nothing like that, there is no description of what they did. It is written in this strange Hebrew poetry. It is couched in language that is discreet, it is tasteful, it is also very describing. Solomon talks about her garden. Nobody thinks that he's talking about a flower garden. He's using poetic language is what he's doing. And without question, these verses are the most explicit in all the Bible without using explicit language. It is actually brilliant, I think, how that God guided Solomon to write about the most sensitive subject at all, put it in the Bible. The subject is not ignored as if problems go away by themselves or it's just going to take care of itself. It is not written to embarrass, it is written to strengthen marriages. And here's what you'll notice, if you haven't already in the Song of Solomon, that every verse is heavy in symbolism. In chapter 4, verse 1 through 5, we'll read these verses. He describes her, but he describes her beauty in symbolic language. None of us men have ever used the language that he uses to describe his wife. It wouldn't go over. In chapter 4, verse 11 through 15, he describes his desire for her. He talks about a fountain and a spring and a well and a garden. It is poetic, symbolic language. Even when she responds in chapter 4 and verse 16, she does it very discreetly, very tastefully. It's with more symbolism. And so here's what we have to understand, that the symbolism makes it very tasteful, but it's not just symbolic talking. And the challenges that we have as Bible students is to decipher the symbolism exactly as it was meant to be. I remember the first time that I ever preached in a foreign country, in a foreign language that I didn't know, through an interpreter. And I learned very quickly what nearly every preacher learns that first experience, is that all of your American colloquialisms and slang sayings and all of your American jokes don't fly. You got to strip all of the junk out of your sermon is what you've got to do. If I come up here this morning and I say, I have the blues, or somebody gave me a cold shoulder, or that should be a piece of cake to do that. You will know exactly what I'm talking about. But you say that in a foreign country, I have the blues, they wouldn't know what you're talking, they don't get that. So when you use those phrases in a foreign culture, they don't recognize those kinds of sayings, and you have to strip all of that stuff out of your sermon and get rid of all of those slang phrases. So when we're reading this, it's almost as if we're reading it as foreigners. They knew exactly what they were talking about. Any Jewish person reading this would know exactly what they were talking about, but we have to decipher the symbolism to get the message, and the Holy Spirit helps us to do exactly that. Now here's the scene. The book is not chronologically, remember that. It's a series of reflections and flashback scenes. It goes from the present to the past and back to the present and back and forth. And the book began in chapter 1 with the Shulamite on her wedding day. She's reminiscing on how she got to this place to marry Solomon the king. She's self-conscious about her appearance. She says, I am black but comely, but yet she is excited to marry. She's looking forward to her husband because the first thing she says in verse number 1 and verse number 2 is, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. You know exactly what she's thinking about. She's thinking about kissing him. Then we move to a wedding banquet. Every good wedding has a banquet feast, a lot of food for the guests. And Solomon and the Shulamite are sitting off in the corner, and they're talking in a private moment, and they're oohing and they're awing and they're gushing over each other. And then the talk continues to the bridal chamber at the end of chapter 1, where the love talk continues. It is all through the eyes, all through the voice of the Shulamite. She's reflecting on this day and everything that has transpired. Chapter 2, verse 6 is the end of the bridal chamber scene. Look, if you would, chapter 2, verse 6. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand doth embrace me. They're not just shaking hands. It is obvious that they are embracing. He is holding her close. They are talking. Here's what's interesting, is that the passage stops short of saying that they consummated the marriage. Because in verse 7, she quickly changes the subject. She warns the daughters of Jerusalem about stirring up love before the time. Then in chapter 2, verse 8 through chapter 3 and verse 5, the passage we looked at last week, she's the primary speaker. She reflects on courtship, talking about the time that he would come visit her in the country and and the dream that she had that he was gone. And so she's talking about courtship. So the song goes back and forth. It's not in a straight line like I wish that it would have been. So now she has reflected on courtship, and now she snaps back in chapter 3, verse 6. She snaps back to the present, and she's going to talk about the marriage again. And there are two parts to it. There is a wedding procession. There is wedding pleasure. Chapter 3, verse 6 through chapter 5 and verse 1. I've got to hurry. I really do. So look, if you would, in chapter 3 and verse number 6. Who is this that cometh out of the wilderness like pillars of smoke, perfumed with myrrh and frankincense, with all powders of the merchant? What this is describing is a wedding party. We don't know who asked the question, who is this? But it may be just a literary device. It could be what a lot of people are saying. But they see this entourage is coming out of the north, and there's great pageantry, and there's smoke, and there's incense billowing up, and it says that somebody very important is coming. It is probable that everybody in Jerusalem knew about the courtship. They knew about this day. And so the question is really an expression of excitement, not wonderment who's coming. They know who's coming, that they're excited about it. In these customs, the procession would always start at the bride's house, either the groom coming to get her or sending for her. That's exactly what's happening here. In verse number 7, behold his bed, which is Solomon's. 80 valiant men are about it, of the valiant of Israel. They all hold swords, being expert in war. Every man hath his sword upon his thigh because of fear in the night. Behold his bed, which is Solomon's. It is Solomon's bed. We do not believe that it is Solomon on the bed. And the bed really is like a couch. It's like a seat, or a kind of like a throne-like, and a luxurious, a covered couch or a covered seat, and it would be carried by men on their shoulders. You've seen pictures of somebody, a king or a princess, sitting on a throne, and men carrying it on their shoulders. And so what it's describing is Solomon has sent for her. The wedding procession has started. He has sent this carriage, this couch, this bed to her, and he has sent 60 armed guards to escort her. They're carrying her on a bed like you would carry a queen or a princess or a king. And 60 armed men, they're all with swords, they're surrounding her. And it speaks of Solomon's love for her, because 60 armed soldiers seem a little bit overkill. That's a lot. That's a big armed escort. And I believe that it speaks of Solomon saying, she's precious to me. And I'm going to protect her even on this day. And maybe even 60 men escorting her, maybe even that is a subtle message to anybody in the city that would ever possibly think of harming her. Solomon's letting you know, hey, I will use every power of my position to protect my bride. And that's what's happening. In verse number 9, King Solomon made himself a chariot of the wood of Lebanon. He made the pillars thereof of silver, the bottom thereof of gold, the covering of it of purple, the midst thereof being paved with love for the daughters of Jerusalem. So King Solomon has made himself a special chariot just for this occasion. It is made out of the finest wood from Lebanon. It is covered in silver and gold and purple cloth. And as she comes near to Jerusalem, he goes out to meet her. He's got this special chariot that's made just for this occasion, and he goes out there, and this very luxurious chariot. And then the description of the procession ends with a word to the daughters of Zion in verse number 11. Go forth, O ye daughters of Zion. And behold, King Solomon with the crown, wherewith his mother crowned him in the day of his espousals and in the day of the gladness of his heart. The daughters of Jerusalem, they're told to follow the chariot and to witness as Solomon meets his bride-to-be. He goes out to meet her. Maybe they stop. Maybe he gets her off of the bed and brings her and puts her in the chariot with him, and they finish the procession together. I don't know. I can imagine that. Behind them would be a long train of well-wishers, and And citizens, they would be so jubilant and so excited, and they're all following to the wedding banquet. I don't know if any of you watched the latest royal wedding between, who was it, Prince Charlie or Harold or somebody who, and married Margaret. Anyway, they got married. It was a royal wedding, and some of y'all watched this. I was busy sorting socks or something. I don't know, but I can imagine this scene, having all the pageantry and the pomp and circumstance that a royal wedding would have. And it's interesting in verse number 11 that King Solomon is given a crown by his mother, a special crown, but it's not his royal crown, but it's a special crown that is given by his mother as a wedding gift on this day. By the way, do you know who his mother was? Bathsheba. And so there's a crown made just for this occasion. I'll tell you something very interesting, by the way. It doesn't have anything to do with Song of Solomon. I think it's very interesting. It was a Jewish tradition that Jewish men always wore a crown or a wreath whenever they got married. It was a symbol of joy, is what it was. And so at every Jewish wedding, they always had a crown or a wreath. Boy, there's a great study in the Bible on crowns. I don't have time to get into it. That tradition stopped in AD 70. In AD 70, when Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple was torn down, and Israel was scattered, finally the dispersion began. They stopped that tradition. Even today, in a religious Jewish wedding, they don't wear a crown. Here's what they do. Part of the ceremony is breaking a glass. They will take a glass, like a wine glass, and sometimes they'll wrap it in a napkin or something, and sometimes either the groom does it or the couple does it together. And they will set the glass down. They either throw it down or they'll smash it under their heel. It's called breaking the glass. And basically what they're doing is they are saying, we remember the breaking of Jerusalem and the temple. And it's a symbol. Even in this moment of joy and jubilation, there still is a moment of sobriety. And that broken glass, it symbolizes the wreckage of the past glory and the destruction of the temple. And when the groom breaks the glass, he is saying that though the house of God is broken and demolished, our home is going to be like a miniature temple, a miniature house of God. And I think that's just beautiful. But this is before the destruction of Jerusalem. And Solomon follows the tradition of Jewish men. There is a special crown that symbolizes his great joy for his wife. That's the easy section. Now we get to chapter 4. And I just want to stop and I want to just give a quick word of application, and then we'll cover chapter 4. This is what it says, this is what it means, but what does it mean to you and I? You always have to answer the so what. And the lesson that I take away from this is that marriage involves a ceremony, a public ceremony, and a legal recognition. It may not have all the pomp and the pageantry of a royal wedding that this wedding had, but the Bible knows nothing about living together, shacking up, common law marriages. The Bible knows nothing about that. Living together, I don't care how long it's been, it does not make a marriage. A marriage must follow whatever the customs and the culture demands. Whatever that is, that marriage should be publicly recognized. And that's what you're seeing. There's wedding procession. Chapter 4, there are wedding pleasures. And chapter 4 takes us past the wedding process, the ceremony of the banquet, and again we're taken into the honeymoon suite. She has talked about this in chapter 2. Now the scene comes back to it, and now Solomon takes over. It is Solomon speaking mostly in the chapter. He compliments her on his beauty. He describes her. He starts with her eyes. He works his way down. He is telling her what he finds attractive about her. Look, if you would, chapter 4, verse 1. I've got to hurry. Behold, thou art fair, my love. Behold, thou art fair. Thou hast dove's eyes within thy locks. Thy hair is a flock of goats that appear from Mount Gilead. He says, thou art fair. Fair is beautiful. It's a description of her countenance. She thought she was dark, but comely. He said, you are fair. You are fair to me. Then he describes her eyes. The veil has been taken off. He can look into her eyes. He is captivated by her. The eyes are the window of the soul. When he looks into her eyes, he sees gentleness and he sees calmness. Then he describes her hair as a flock of goats. What a strange looking woman. Now, he doesn't say that she is a goat or that she looks like a goat. That's not what he's saying. But it's symbolism. It's symbolism. The shepherd would be in Mount Gilead and he would see black goats that are coming off of the mountain, and as they come down off the mountain, it's like a wave. And basically what he's describing that scene. Your hair is like that black wave that's coming down off the mountain. You might say that your hair is golden as smooth as silk, perhaps. Something like that. Huh? But this is how that he would describe it. For a country girl, it would actually be a compliment. For my wife, I don't think that she would get it. But he's complimenting her on her hair. Verse 2. Thy teeth are like a flock of sheep that are even shorn, which came up from the washing, wherefore of every one bear twins, and none is barren among them. He looks at her mouth, he says, your teeth, they're white. It's like lambs that have been washed. A lamb's white already, but you wash the lamb. They're snow white. He says, which came up from the white. They're like bear twins. They're even, and none is barren among them. She's got all of her teeth. All of them. I tell you, there is nothing that will ruin romance like funky breath on a bride. He's describing her teeth. Verse 3, thy lips are like a thread of scarlet, thy speech is comely, thy temples are like a piece of a pomegranate within thy locks. He's looking at her mouth. And I think he's imagining kissing her. Thy lips are like a thread of scarlet. I don't know, maybe she's put on red lipstick. Thy speech is comely, thy temples, and most commentators think that would include the cheeks as well. They're rosy red. See how he's describing her? He says in verse 4, thy neck is like the tower of David, builded for an armory, whereon there hang 1,000 bucklers, all shields of mighty men. Now, nobody's just settled on what the Tower of David is. It's either a tower that David built or a tower that Solomon built and named after his father David. We don't know. But they say that soldiers would come and they would line their shields along the walls of that tower, and it was their sign of allegiance to David. They would hang their shields there. And when you look down that tower, you just see a long row of shields just lined up in a row. Here's what he says. He says, thy neck is like that, whereon there hang 1,000 bucklers, all shields of mighty men. She's probably wearing a necklace with jewelry, and he's looking at that, and it reminds me of the shields in those towers, and those shields that hang on the Tower of David, and she's tall and erect and regal, and she carries herself well. That's what he's describing. Verse number 5. He said, thy two breasts are like two young roes that are twins, which feed among the lilies. Does anybody have any idea what he's talking about there? See, we're nervous. I understand that. But I told you at the beginning, and you said amen, all Bible is inspired of God, right? One old commentator got a little embarrassed here, and so he had to find out what this means. So he said, thy two breasts. He said, that's the Old Testament and the New Testament. And I'm not trying to put images in your head, but I don't think Solomon was given a Bible lesson right here. I don't think so. He's describing his wife's beauty, and he compliments her, and he tells her that she is beautiful to him. Verse number 6, until the daybreak and the shadows flee away, I will get me to the mountain of myrrh and to the hill of frankincense. Commentators differ on what that last statement means, and I'm not even going to speculate, but it sounds passionate, it sounds erotic, and it is in this setting. It is very sensuous talk. He is talking about being intimate with his wife. He's looking forward to it, and he says, I could spend all night with you. Boy, what a passage. I'll take a moment for application here, and here's the application, all right? If you notice through the Song of Solomon how he is always complimenting his wife. He cannot say enough good things about her to her. He never criticizes her. He never puts her down. One of the things that a lot of ladies suffer from is low self-esteem. And it's really bad when the husband, who is supposed to be her protector, feeds that self-esteem issue with put-downs and with insults. So do you ever praise your wife? Do you ever compliment your wife to her? Why would you ever want to tear her down when you could just as easily build her up? And too many times marriages begins with compliments and they end with insults, and that should never be. And you think about why would God put this scene in the Word of God? It's about lovemaking in marriage, but Solomon doesn't just rush into things. Solomon praises her, Solomon compliments her, he spends time with her, he woos her, he romances her. It is not all about him, it is about her as well. He uses romance, he puts thought into this, he is sincere in his praise. And every husband this morning ought to be romantic to your wife. I don't care if you are old as the hills. I promise you that you cannot praise her enough publicly, and you cannot praise her too much privately. You cannot tell her too many times how beautiful she is to you. And if you'll do that, you'll discover that she has the power to make you a very happy man, not just in the bedroom, but in the satisfaction of having a wife that adores you and is loyal to you and devoted to you and loves you with all of your heart. And it's not just sexual intimacy, but intimacy of the heart and intimacy of the soul. And that's what this passage is about. So verse number 7, he continues. He says, "Thou art all fair, my love. There is no spot in thee." He continues to compliment his wife. Bear in mind, he is seeing her now for the first time in the most intimate of settings, intimate for him, very vulnerable for her. He's been describing her body, and now here's what he says. You're just beautiful. In fact, you're perfect. He says, you don't have one flaw. Everything about you is flawless. You are a picture of perfection. Now here is my question. Was that true? Do you believe that this woman is the most beautiful creature who ever lived and had no physical flaws? She is absolutely flawless. Really, we don't know. We don't know what she looked like except that she had all of her teeth. That's the only thing that we know. Right? She's never described in language that we can relate to. You could not take the description in the first 5 verses and have an artist paint a picture of her that would be one strange looking woman, all right? We really don't know what she looked like. So the Bible doesn't tell us what she looked like. The Bible tells us what she looked like to Solomon. She is described only through his eyes. We see her only as he sees her. We know what she looked like to Solomon, and that is the point. Verse number 8. Oh, I wish I had more time. Verse 8. Come with me from Lebanon, my spouse, with me from Lebanon. Look from the top of Ammon, from the top of Shinar and Hermon, from the lion's den, from the mountains of the lepers. Now, commentators look at this and they're puzzled. Why would Solomon be asking her to come from Lebanon when she's already in Jerusalem in their bedroom? And here's the only thing that I can say is that Lebanon is from the north. She's from the north country. And it could be that he's telling her to leave your thoughts behind and be engaged with me. Just forget that. This is a very vulnerable night for her, and he wants her to be engaged with him mentally. I don't want you to be homesick on this night. I'm doing everything that I can to make you comfortable and to feel loved. He mentions the lion's den and the mountains of the lepers. And again, this is a little bit of speculation. I'm not sure. Those mountains evidently were home to lions and lepers. If so, that would be a very dangerous place. Maybe he mentions that as a symbol of fear and insecurity. I don't know. But there's none of that here. There's nothing here to be afraid of. You are safe with me. If I'm misreading that, please come and tell me what it means. Verse number 9. Thou hast ravished my heart, my sister, my spouse. Thou hast ravished my heart with one of thine eyes, with one chain of thy neck. Do you think that she's getting tired of hearing it by now? I don't think so. When he says, thou hast ravished my heart with one of thy eyes, it doesn't mean that she's got one eye. But what he's saying is, I can look in just one of your eyes, and it makes my heart beat faster. Just that one necklace hanging so delicately around your neck, and I am left speechless. She never tires of it. Verse number 10. How fair is thy love, my sister, my spouse. How much better is thy love than wine, and the smell of thy ointments than all spices. Thy lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb. Honey and milk are under thy tongue, and the smell of thy garments is like the smell of Lebanon. By the way, 5 times Solomon calls her his sister. It's actually a term of endearment. It signifies a close friendship. She's not just an object to him. She is his best friend. I don't see her just as a pretty body. I see her as a soulmate. Now, all of this talk going on is going to be really hard to do without some kissing. And I think that's what happens in verse 11. Thy lips, O my spouse, drop as the honeycomb. Honey and milk are under thy tongue. How would you know? Because he has kissed her. He talks about her kiss, her smell, her touch. She has an intoxicating effect on him. Verse 12. A garden enclosed is my sister, my spouse. A spring shut up, a fountain sealed. When you put that verse in this chapter, it's very obvious that he's talking about sexuality. He speaks of her sexuality as an enclosed garden or a spring that was shut up. You can read how in ancient literature, ancient cultures, that sometimes it referred to a woman in explicit terms, and that's what this is saying. He is speaking of her virginity, that up to this time, there has been a wall. It has been shut up, and that is rightly so, but no longer. A garden encloses my sister, my spouse, a spring shut up, a fountain sealed. He said, thy plants are an orchard of pomegranates with pleasant fruits, camphire and spikenard and saffron, calamus and cinnamon, and all trees of frankincense, myrrh and aloes, with all the chief spices. And this is one of those verses where I say that whatever you think he is saying, that's exactly what he's saying. But here's what I thought. There is no literal garden that exists with all of these spices and all of these fruits in one place. There is no place on earth like this. And that's exactly what he thinks of his wife. You are a dream come true. If you were describing this in terms of a garden, I would describe a garden that is just absolutely impossible, that lives only in a fantasy or a dream that you just cannot imagine, that it would never really exist. And when I think of my wife and I think of the joy of being with her and growing together in intimacy and all of this, you are somebody who lives only in dreams, but you are real. That's what he's talking about. In verse 16, she speaks. Awake, O north wind, and come, thou south. Blow upon my garden, that the spices thereof may flow out, that my beloved come into his garden and eat his pleasant fruits. Chapter 4, verse 16 is the most sensuous statement in the Song of Solomon, and God put it there. She says in verse number 16, blow upon my garden. But then she says, let my beloved come into his garden. I have protected myself and my virginity so that I can give myself fully to my husband. Now the scene's going to end in chapter 5 and verse 1, and I want you to see something. He speaks again. He says, I'm coming to my garden, my sister, my spouse. I've gathered my myrrh with my spice. I've eaten my honeycomb with my honey. I've drunk my wine with my milk. It had been spoken of as hers. Now he speaks of it as his. When you get married, you no longer belong to yourself. You relinquish that right to someone else. Now it is his. And that is proper. That is good. But I want you to notice something, and I'm done. And I'm done. Look at the last phrase. O friends, drink. Yea, drink abundantly, O beloved. Who is speaking? I believe that that phrase is the only time that God speaks in the book. I believe that's God. And I believe that God says this is right, this is proper, and I made this for you. And He invites a man and a woman to enjoy each other intimately, to be gentle, to be kind, to be considerate, and to draw us closely together as two people possibly can. Now, I have tried. You can understand why I didn't want to take 2 weeks in this passage. I wanted to get done in 1 week. And I've tried to be discreet and tasteful and respectful. I don't like crude language. I don't like sexual innuendos. I don't like double talk. I don't like flirty men. I don't like loose women. I don't like sensual dress on women. I don't like playboys. I don't like any of that. Years ago, we had a boy come into our church, a man come into our church, and he was just a flirt is what he was, and he was a divorced guy, and so he would just come around and hug the women and pat them on the shoulder and rub their arm and everything, and it was just a little creepy, and then he did it to my wife, and so I went to him, and I invited him to go to another church is what I did, and just, you know, you're going to get hurt if you stay around here, and so he did. He felt of the Lord to go somewhere else, and I don't like stuff like that. Sometimes we hide our head in the sand like an ostrich, and we imagine that Christian couples don't have real problems. And we haven't turned this into counseling, and I don't want to know anything about your private lives. I'm not interested in anything risque. I'm not interested in anything for shock value, nothing inappropriate. But marriages should be enjoyable, and God designed it so. There ought to be gentleness, and there ought to be consideration, and there ought to be kindness, and there ought to be respect, and there ought to be praise, and there ought to be genuine love, and there ought to be close friendship. And if the devil can attack you in the bedroom, he will. But God put a man and a woman together and said, I give you the greatest pleasure, and let it be a gateway for intimacy in every way. In every way. And I think that's exactly what you see in this section. But in chapter 5 and verse 2, something happens that threatens to destroy it all. And we'll look at it next week.